For most of his life, the night sky had been a place of comfort rather than mystery. The moon, especially, followed a dependable rhythm, rising, brightening, fading, and returning with mechanical patience that could be predicted years in advance. From a small backyard observatory, assembled piece by piece over decades, the observer spent evenings recording positions, shadows, and surface features, not searching for revelations, but enjoying consistency. The telescope was calibrated, the logs were tidy, and the routine rarely changed. On one clear night, however, a minor irregularity appeared near the lunar terminator, an area where light and darkness meet and exaggerate surface detail. It was nothing dramatic, just a shadow that seemed slightly too deliberate, a line that did not soften as the minutes passed. He noted it carefully, assuming atmospheric distortion or a temporary alignment of light. When the observation session ended, the note remained a footnote, easily explained away by fatigue or expectation. At the time, there was no reason to suspect the record would matter later. Over the following weeks, similar nights returned, and with them the same feature, always close to the same region, never exactly identical, yet never absent. The observer adjusted equipment, replaced components, and cross-checked data with publicly available lunar maps, finding nothing that matched the shape he was documenting. What unsettled him was not the possibility of error, but the persistence. Shadows should shift, blur, or vanish as angles change, yet this one seemed to maintain proportion. It was subtle enough to escape casual attention, and that subtlety made it easy to ignore. Still, the logs grew thicker, annotated with times, atmospheric conditions, and minor corrections, all pointing toward the same conclusion. Something remained when it should not. The moon continued its cycles, and life continued with it. But the sense of routine had begun to thin, replaced by a quiet awareness that observation was no longer passive. He considered sharing the findings, but hesitated, aware that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary restraint, especially when evidence remained incomplete and vulnerable to interpretation. Eventually, curiosity outweighed hesitation, and the observer reached out to a former aerospace analyst known for practical skepticism. The response was cautious but attentive, focusing on methods rather than conclusions. Images were compared, timestamps verified, and alternative explanations listed without dismissal. The analyst noted that instruments could mislead, and that perception adapts under repetition. Yet even those caveats left space for uncertainty. Nothing in the data proved intent or origin, but it suggested persistence. For part 1, the significance lay not in discovery, but in the shift it caused. The moon had not changed, yet the act of watching it had. A familiar object had become something that demanded attention, quietly, patiently, as if waiting for observation to continue. The story would unfold slowly, grounded in records, questions, and the uneasy patience of continued observation. No conclusions were drawn, only a commitment to watch, measure, and document whatever followed next with care, discipline, and an awareness of human limits alone. Asterisk in the weeks that followed, the observer altered his routine without fully acknowledging why. Sessions grew longer, beginning earlier in the evening and stretching past the hours he once reserved for rest. He adjusted angles with deliberate slowness, allowing his eyes to adapt before making any notes, resisting the urge to search for the shape he had already learned to expect. Instead, he focused on verifying what should have been visible, cross-referencing craters, ridges, and plains whose outlines were well documented. Yet each time the lunar surface drifted into clarity, the same irregular presence returned, faint but consistent, positioned where shadow should have thinned. Its outline seemed to respond to light rather than obey it, remaining proportionate even as the terminator shifted. The effect was not dramatic, but it carried a sense of insistence, as though the feature existed independently of observation, Merely allowing itself to be seen. Data sharing became unavoidable. The analyst reviewed raw files rather than summaries, requesting unedited captures and calibration records. Nothing suggested manipulation or equipment failure, and the timestamps aligned cleanly with known lunar cycles. What concerned the analyst was not what appeared, but what did not. There were no corresponding records from automated surveys, no flagged anomalies in public databases, yet the observer's data refused to dissolve under scrutiny. A pattern emerged in timing, appearing during specific lighting conditions that should have erased detail rather than preserved it. Explanations were proposed and set aside methodically, each discarded only after comparison against repeat observations. The process was slow, procedural, and intentionally dull, yet the absence of resolution created its own pressure. Outside the observatory, daily life continued, though attention wandered. News of renewed lunar missions surfaced occasionally, framed as technological progress, but the observer found himself listening for what was not said. He avoided speculation, aware that imagination fills gaps faster than evidence. Yet the silence surrounding decades of incomplete exploration lingered uncomfortably. For Part 2, the story remained grounded in method, not meaning. Nothing had been proven, and no claim had been made. Still, the act of watching had changed direction. Observation was no longer a one-sided act. Something persistent had entered the routine, subtle enough to deny certainty, steady enough to demand continuation, shaping the nights that followed with quiet expectation. It was during this period that restraint became the defining discipline. Neither man sought publicity, understanding how easily attention could distort incomplete findings. Records were duplicated and stored separately, observations repeated without commentary, and conclusions deliberately postponed. The moon remained unchanged to the casual eye, bright and familiar in public imagination, while private logs accumulated subtle inconsistencies that resisted dismissal. For Part 2, tension did not arise from threat but from patience, from the sense that continued observation was being silently permitted. The question was no longer whether the anomaly existed, but how long it had been present, unnoticed, waiting for someone willing to watch carefully enough and to record each detail without haste, judgment, or expectation of immediate answers ahead. Asterisk as the observations accumulated. A pattern began to assert itself with quiet confidence. The anomaly did not appear randomly, nor did it align with moments of peak clarity. Instead, it emerged during transitional light, when shadows lengthened and surface detail should have softened into ambiguity. On nights when atmospheric conditions were nearly identical, the feature returned with a consistency that defied coincidence. Measurements taken across months revealed proportional stability, as though the shape responded to geometry rather than chance. This was not evidence of purpose, but it suggested endurance. The observer documented angles, exposure settings, and timing with increasing precision, aware that repetition can deceive the mind. Yet the records resisted simplification. Each entry stood alone, and together they formed a sequence that could not be dismissed without ignoring the data entirely. The analyst compared these findings against historical imagery, not to confirm presence, but to identify absence. Older scans showed nothing comparable, yet they were limited by resolution and compression. Modern instruments should have captured the feature if it were prominent, but prominence was never the claim. What mattered was scale and persistence. The anomaly occupied a threshold where detection becomes uncertain, existing at the edge of notice. That ambiguity complicated verification, but it also explained how something could remain overlooked for decades. Discussions remained technical and restrained, focused on margins of error and probability. The more they attempted to disprove the observations, the more resilient the pattern became, surviving each reasonable challenge without revealing its nature. Asterisk unease emerged not from any single image, but from convergence. Independent checks produced similar results when conditions matched, suggesting that perception alone could not account for what was recorded. The observer felt the weight of repetition, the way routine transforms into vigilance without announcement. Nights grew quieter as attention narrowed, the telescope no longer a hobby, but an instrument of careful waiting. There was no sense of threat, only the awareness that observation might be reciprocal. The moon continued its indifferent passage across the sky, while logs filled with notes that refused to settle. Attempts to pause the work proved brief, interrupted by the need to confirm, to see whether absence would finally occur. It did not. The feature appeared again, unchanged, indifferent to expectation. By the end of this phase, the question shifted subtly. It was no longer about identifying what the anomaly was, but understanding why it appeared only when watched in a certain way. That realization carried a quiet discomfort, the kind that does not demand action, but erodes certainty over time, leaving the observer committed to continue, aware that whatever followed would unfold slowly. Records were backed up, timestamps synchronized, and methods repeated to exhaustion, yet the outcome remained unchanged. Each confirmation reduced the comfort of error and increased the burden of attention, turning patience into obligation and curiosity into a measured resolve. Nothing announced itself, but the silence surrounding the finding began to feel deliberate, persistent, and quietly resistant to dismissal over time, steadily asterisk. By the time the fourth phase began, observation had shifted from curiosity to responsibility. The records were no longer a private archive, but a sustained body of work, too consistent to abandon without explanation. The observer reduced external variables further, isolating sessions to specific windows when conditions matched earlier appearances. Each adjustment narrowed the range of doubt, yet certainty remained out of reach. The anomaly continued to present itself, without variation in size or proportion, maintaining its presence as though unaffected by scrutiny. It did not grow clearer, nor did it fade, existing in a stable ambiguity that resisted every attempt at classification. That stability, more than any dramatic change, created tension. Things that endure without explanation challenge assumptions quietly, forcing attention without offering reward. The analyst introduced comparative simulations, recreating lighting angles digitally to test whether known formations could produce similar effects. The results were inconclusive. Some configurations approached resemblance, but failed under close inspection, lacking the proportional consistency seen in the recordings. This did not confirm anything, but it weakened the comfort of coincidence. Discussions remained restrained, limited to what could be demonstrated rather than imagined. Both understood how easily speculation could outpace evidence, and restraint became an unspoken agreement. Still, the accumulation of unresolved data altered perspective. The moon, once a fixed reference point, now felt less static, its surface layered with unanswered questions hidden in plain sight. The sense of unease deepened through repetition rather than escalation. The observer noticed subtle shifts in his own behavior, the way anticipation crept into routine despite deliberate neutrality. Nights without observation felt incomplete, while nights with observation carried the quiet pressure of expectation. The anomaly did not respond to focus, yet its reliability suggested tolerance, as if persistence were being permitted rather than resisted. That impression was not recorded, acknowledged only as a subjective response, carefully separated from data. Even so, the distinction between observer and observation felt thinner. The act of watching had become participatory, shaping nights around the possibility of reappearance rather than certainty. External interest remained absent, and that absence itself became notable. Public missions, announcements, and imagery offered no reference point, no accidental corroboration. The silence surrounding lunar observation felt deliberate, though no motive could be assigned. For Part 4, the story did not advance through discovery, but through realization. The anomaly was not demanding attention. It was allowing it. That difference mattered. It reframed the experience as one of endurance rather than pursuit. The observer understood that whatever existed on the moon, if anything at all, would not be revealed through urgency. Only continued, disciplined observation could maintain the integrity of the record dot as this phase closed. The logs reflected an unchanged conclusion. Nothing had been proven, yet nothing had been disproven. The anomaly persisted at the edge of detection, stable, patient, and indifferent to interpretation. The observer prepared to continue, aware that the next phase would not bring answers. Only further confirmation of a presence defined entirely by its refusal to be explained. Acknowledged or dismissed, asterisk by the fifth stage. Avoidance was no longer possible. What had begun as careful observation had narrowed into a fixed obligation, one shaped by repetition rather than urgency. The anomaly continued to appear within the same narrow window of conditions, never early, never late, as if governed by a rule neither man could identify. Attempts to ignore it failed quietly. Nights passed where the telescope remained covered, yet the absence felt heavier than the effort of watching. The observer understood that whatever meaning the pattern held would not announce itself through discovery, only through continued restraint. This was no longer about proving anything to others. It was about maintaining continuity, preserving the integrity of a record that now spanned years. The analyst, increasingly aware of the implications of persistence, began to treat the data as a boundary rather than a subject. They discussed what could be shared and what should remain private, not out of fear, but responsibility. Incomplete information invites distortion, and distortion attracts attention that reshapes truth into performance. The decision was made to continue without publication, to allow the anomaly to exist without interference. This restraint marked a turning point. Observation was no longer exploratory. It was custodial. The moon remained distant, unchanged in public imagination, while private records documented a quiet inconsistency that refused to resolve. For Part 5, tension arose from inevitability. The observer recognized that the anomaly was no longer merely present. It was expected. Each session confirmed that expectation, reinforcing a cycle that felt self-sustaining. The feature never signaled awareness, yet its reliability suggested accommodation. It neither advanced nor retreated, existing within the same narrow limits, as if content to remain unnoticed beyond this singular focus. That neutrality unsettled more than any sudden change could have. Things that react are easier to interpret than things that endure without response. During this phase, a subtle shift occurred in interpretation. The question was no longer what the anomaly was, but what role observation played in its persistence. This was not framed as cause and effect, but correlation. The moon had been watched by countless instruments, yet only under specific, patient conditions did this feature assert itself. That realization carried weight. It suggested that some phenomena do not reveal themselves through scale or intensity, but through attention measured carefully over time as nights accumulated. The observer prepared for the possibility that nothing would change. Acceptance replaced anticipation, and with it came clarity. The obligation was no longer to find answers, but to remain consistent. The anomaly did not demand understanding. It demanded acknowledgement. Part 5 closed not with escalation, but with recognition that the situation had reached a threshold. Whatever followed would not be discovered quickly. It would unfold slowly or not at all, leaving only the record as evidence that something subtle had been seen. Patiently, repeatedly, and without conclusion. Asterisk by the final phase, time itself had become part of the record. The logs no longer read like notes taken during observation, but like markers placed along a long, quiet road. Dates stretched back farther than the observer had expected, forming a continuous line of attention that refused to end cleanly. Nothing dramatic had occurred, yet the absence of resolution carried its own gravity. The anomaly remained present under the same conditions, unchanged in proportion and position, indifferent to years passing. It had not revealed purpose, origin, or intent. It had simply remained. The analyst reviewed the complete archive one last time, not searching for proof but for failure. None appeared. Every reasonable alternative had been tested, documented, and set aside without certainty. The conclusion, if it could be called that, was limited and unsatisfying. Something had been observed repeatedly, and observation alone had altered nothing. There was no indication of escalation, no sign of retreat. The feature did not grow clearer, nor did it dissolve. It existed only as a persistent irregularity, sustained by patience and careful restraint. For Part 6, the story did not end with discovery, but with a decision. The observer chose to stop active investigation, not because answers had been found, but because continuing no longer changed the outcome. The telescope remained, the logs were preserved, and the data was secured, waiting for a future context that might give it meaning. This was not surrender. It was recognition that some questions resist immediate resolution, and that forcing conclusions can erase the value of careful observation. In the months that followed, the moon returned to its familiar role in the sky, bright and unremarkable to those who glanced upward without intention. Public missions advanced, announcements were made, and images circulated, none of them contradicting or confirming what had been recorded. The silence remained intact. No correction arrived. No explanation surfaced. The anomaly persisted only in private records and memory. Even now, the observer cannot say with certainty what was seen. He can only say when it appeared, how often, and under what conditions. That limitation defines the truth of the experience. The moon did not change, yet attention did. Whatever existed, if anything at all, required patience rather than pursuit. The story ends not with answers, but with restraint, with the understanding that some things remain visible only to those willing to watch without expectation, and to stop when watching no longer brings clarity. It remains possible that future tools will revisit the same region and notice nothing at all, or notice something different entirely. If that happens, the record will still stand as a measure of attention rather than evidence of meaning. The value lies in discipline, in noting what appears and refusing to decide too quickly what it must represent. Until then, the moon continues its cycles, and the unanswered space between observation and explanation remains quietly intact, unchanged by belief, dismissal, or time. It waits without comment, without urgency, without promise or reply.